Hello everyone, another week, another video. So today we've got three topics, going to be a bit of a shorter video, hopefully at least, which is the idea of landings, cutting to versus cutting through, and when your cut blends into a thrust, cutting to a thrust, or alternatively thrusting to a cut. So let's get into it, shall we? Now, these are concepts that I've touched upon in the recent cutting video and also in the quarterstaff video, but when it comes to landings, what I'm talking about is the idea of every cut, regardless of what cut it is, will generally move through three guards. So it has three landing points, if you will, three action shots. So, for example, for an overhaul, I start up here, I hit when I move into Langenort, and then I finish in Alber. The idea being that if I hit here, I'm safe. If they come at me, I'm safe. If I finish and I've missed and they come at me, I'm safe. Because once I'm in these positions, I can move into an adequate defense. That's why they're good guards. Because they limit what my opponent can do to me, and if I've properly formed them, then my brain is on the subject. It's like, okay, we're here. We can do X, Y, Z from here. We need to do this, right? Versus, if I get stuck between them, right, so here-ish, now my brain has to go, okay, we've kind of got the properties of this, we've kind of got the properties of this, I need to do something along these lines. Not that you can't do it, just that it's not a good idea. You don't want to get stuck between these landing points, because then you're unable to form a predictable offense or defense. So, the reason I call them landings, by the way, is because I imagine a staircase. You're not able to rest on the stairs themselves, but you are able to rest on the landing points. And that's just why I call them that. Regardless of what cut you're doing, for example, if I cut from below, 2, 3, you can even sometimes see it go 1, 2, 3, where I, rather than going through, I'm instead recovering to a different guard. I always want to get into that habit, unless I am cutting to my opponent, in which case my third point becomes when I hit them. So let's start talking about that. So cutting to versus cutting through. I have touched upon it before. Cutting through is the easier of the two to explain. It's just when I'm going to hit my opponent and I decide I'm going all the way through. If they back up, I should terminate down here. If I hit them, in theory, if I were cutting them, I should still terminate down here. Not always going to happen with our modern equipment, of course. There's no need to worry about it. But the intent is there. However, cutting to is a little bit different. When it comes to cutting to, the idea is that I'm going to strike out to a central point. And it's an extended point, it's not a near point. So, for reference here, hopefully the camera can see this. This is me extending and cutting through. I'm still getting quite a bit of reach. This is me cutting to. It gets a little bit more reach. Because I'm not aiming for the same point I was before, I'm aiming for a point a little bit further. Because I'm going along this line, versus the other cut was going along this line. It's that intent that makes it the difference. So when do you use cutting to versus cutting through? Well, cutting to is usually most of your more direct attacks. So for example, if they are in a point forward guard, or alternatively, they are cutting at you and you're looking to use a counter cut. That's when cutting to is going to happen. Because what I need to do is I need my cut to set aside their cut and hit them at the same time. So I need that energy going out in a straight line, and I need my guard to be coming to this central point. Does that still form three guards? Yeah, it does, actually. Because I end up 1, 2 when I hit that center, 3 is that little bit of extra extension. So it still does have the 3 points. Cutting through is usually used more for when you're just test cutting in general, or when you're moving. So for example, my opponent is backing up, I was already kind of in motion, I'm just going to cut through and keep going. Alternatively, I have hit my opponent, I'm going to cut through to withdraw. Something along those lines. Very, very good for that. Also, usually when I cut for an extremity, for example a hand, I'll come here, I will cut through, because it's more likely that if I hit the hand, 1, I can go through, and we are told to try and take the hand off. And 2, if they move their hand, I want to be ending up in that third position so I can attack, as opposed to being stuck here and not really having many offensive options. cutting to, cutting through, that's one part of it. The second part of it is the idea of flowing into it. So this is mostly used for when the opponent backs up and you have to then pursue them, which is a whole topic in and of itself, but we'll get into that another time. So when it comes to cutting to an opponent and they just back up from you, your next move is going to usually be a thrust. Regardless of what cut you did, you're in a point forward guard. You could absolutely launch into another cut, but you're already extended, and if they're just backing away from you, you have the vor in spades. You should continue attacking with the fastest thing possible. Just the other day, I was sparring with my guys, with Messer, and one of them cut to, I backed up, and he just came forward in that same tempo. There was nothing I could do, and he got me. Really well done. Because he took the fastest route possible to get that hit in, nothing changed between us. So what I mean by that is if you've already cut down and it was gonna hit your opponent, and they've just backed up, if you extend / move with them as they move back, they didn't change anything. You've robbed them of their retreat, and there's not a lot of time for them to do anything. It's not that they can't, it's that generally you'll get a hit. It's a surprising thing. Cutting through, on the other hand, this one, it's usually best if I cut through and my opponent backs up to just go ahead and flow into another cut. Regardless of what cut that is. It could also be down, up, that's a great one, something along those lines. The reason I want to go through is because if I'm already cutting through and I try to stop myself, I've not extended. I mean, it's not that I can't, it's just that it's really awkward to do that. So I was cutting through, I've had to stop my momentum, now I have to repower my momentum. You've lost the tempo. Versus, my opponent backs up, okay, I just keep going. The other good thing about this is that usually, if someone backs away from you cutting to, they're probably only moving about this much. Not always the case, but I find usually that is so. So the thrust will usually get them. If, however, an opponent is springing back from your through cut, usually they're actually backing out of distance, which makes them a little bit harder to pursue. Which means that me having this second passing step is going to cover a lot more ground much more quickly. Another alternative is you don't even have to do passing steps. I've done this before where I've cut and done gathering steps coming at people, etc. Now, the good thing about that is you cover more ground, it's very great for following them through, and with this flow, you can do, I've basically got 3 cut options presented to me right now. I can cut back up, I can cut from my left, I can even cut from my right again. Which means that he has to guess one of 3 to guard while running backwards, and I am closing that distance with him. Very, very good. So thrust has speed, but it's predictable. Cutting through has less predictable options, but it's a little slower, but it covers more distance. So that's kind of the flow with those, and it also applies when you're going backward. So, for example, my opponent is cutting at me and I don't want to engage. I cut 2 to parry, now I keep my point in front and withdraw. What that makes it is so that now I've parried, he has to deal with my blade as he comes forward, which means that I can dictate where it's going to go as I gain distance. So same idea there, versus if I hit here and then tried to do a cut while backing up to expel it or anything, I've left the blade, he can follow me. If alternatively, my opponent is coming at me and I don't want to mess with him, I can step back with cuts. Most people will not walk into that. And I can direct those cuts to parry possible offenses he's giving. That's where I do want to use it. So, that's kind of a basic little musing, and I wish I had another person here so I could show it a little better, but that's cutting to versus cutting through. Now, what about cutting to a thrust, or even combining them? So, cutting to a thrust is really the instance in which my cut is directed, so that way usually I hit with the tip of the sword, as opposed to it being like a traditional cut. You see this used in the Schildhau, the Zornhau, the Scheitelhau, strikes that are very directed, and the point is usually what hits the opponent. It's usually about a 50-50 as to whether or not it's a thrust or a cut when it hits, I'd say it's somewhere between the two, and usually both, because I'm hitting with just the tip of the sword. So in these instances where I'm cutting to a thrust, it's really more that I'm cutting to my opponent very directly, and the closest thing to hit him is usually the point. Sometimes it comes in with a cut, sometimes it stabs. That's what cutting to a thrust is. However, there's another form of it. For example, this, cutting through, cut up thrust. That's cutting to a thrust. The idea here being that my cut brought me up and prepped for the thrust, and then I extended it, right? You can even sometimes see that, where I brought my cut up, and stepped out with it, so that way my thrust landed with my step. That's really more like putting a thrust onto the end of your combo, or in the middle of your combo, or whatever you want to do. Not quite the same as with the Meisterhau version, but it is still there. And especially if I'm cutting through and pursuing someone, usually, okay, they backed up, but I've gained that distance, now I'll launch a thrust. And if they set that aside, then I'll follow through with another cut. That starts to become a very good pursuing tactic because it changes things up. Now, thrusting to a cut, a little bit different. For example, I am here, and I extend my thrust. If someone sets it aside, I can absolutely follow through with some winding or what have you. Alternatively, I extend, they set it aside, I turn that into a quick wrist cut. Anytime you extend the arm, one-handed or two-handed, you get this sort of lightness right here, where the fastest thing is going to become your wrist. So, for example, I'm here, oh, my opponent was really open, I missed. I can use that wrist cut to either recover or go forward. And you see this a lot in backsword. It's called a molinet, which is where I use this to recover smartly back into guard. It can be done either way. It can even be done from below or above. But that's really what thrusting to a cut boils down to. So, quick review. We went over the idea of landings, so all of my cuts, regardless of what they are, start in one point, hit in the second point, and then finish in a third point. And I want to because if I form a guard, I'm ready to attack again. If I get stuck between, I'm not ready to attack again. We talked about cutting to, where I am attacking a point along this plane, and it usually ends up as a cut into a thrust. And if the opponent backs up, the fastest thing for me to follow through with is a thrust. We talked about cutting through, where I go past my opponent, because I'm either cutting solidly through the target, or if they back up from me, I'm going to follow it through with another through, because it's just easier to flow that together. And we also talked about the idea of thrusting to a cut and cutting to a thrust. Cutting to a thrust being those directed attacks, or, alternatively, big extensions. And then thrusting to a cut being when you make your arm very light and usually follow it through with a wrist cut. So, like I said, bit of a quicker video this week, but a lot of good concepts to think about and play with. The best way I would say to go about experimenting with these, apart from just adding them into your flow patterns, right? Just say, okay, every time I do these cuts in the Meyer cutting pattern, they're all going to be 2 cuts, right? As in going to target, not as in the number 2. They're all going to be cutting to targets. And so I set like something out and I always am ending up with my point terminated. Or they're all going to be through cuts, so I flow through them. Or you can even do all of my cuts afterwards, I'm going to follow through with a thrust, and then I'm going to follow through with the next cut is going to be going off of that thrust. Things like that. So you can do that to practice it. And then you can start building your combinations around it. And combinations is something that I want to talk about soon, just not quite yet. I want to go over a few more basics. And then we'll start talking about how you build your combo your combo sets, if you will, and how to make them unpredictable and how to make them build upon each other. Because here's the thing. Combinations is just how fighting works, regardless of what kind of fighting it is. Moves blend into other moves, and some work better for other people. But the combos you form now when you're still beginning, you're probably not going to be using them when you change as a fencer. There are combos that I used to use all the time when I was younger that I don't use anymore because I fight differently than I did back then. So for now, don't worry about trying to build ultimate combos. Just build what works and what you can do. experiment with it in sparring, and try to blend in these things. So for example, if all your combos are through cuts, maybe think about adding some two cuts, right? Maybe think about adding some more thrusts. If you always thrust, think about following those thrusts up with a cut. Things like that. And that'll start giving you some ideas. But either way, thank you guys very much for watching, and we will talk about some other techniques another time.